be joined now by Palestinian News Director for Mondoweiss, US-based publication focused on Palestine, and we speak now to Yumna Patel. She speaks to us from Bethlehem in the West Bank. Yumna, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So you are a researcher at Al Jazeera. I don't know if you knew Shireen at all. Can you give us some insight into how the organization has responded? I know one of the colleagues spoke earlier on about shock and horror, but what are you hearing from other colleagues?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I will just say that I'm not a researcher with Al Jazeera. I have worked with Al Jazeera in the past. Obviously, Shireen's colleagues at Al Jazeera are distraught. You know, videos and many testimonies have been shown in the media and on social media of her colleagues just in absolute shock and despair over the killing of Shireen, who was a veteran journalist and correspondent with Al Jazeera. She had been working with the network since 1997. She was a household name in Palestine and across the Arab world, as she was one of the main voices that was bringing Palestinian stories to homes across the Middle East for many years. So people are devastated, her colleagues at Al Jazeera, and also, you know, Palestinian journalists across Palestine, even outside Al Jazeera, are devastated by this incredible loss.
Mm. Have you worked in this environment? I mean, we understand that she was wearing a press vest and was standing with other journalists at the time. So my understanding is that being so clearly visible, this shouldn't have happened. She shouldn't have been rendered vulnerable.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. You can see from videos taken at the scene and from multiple journalists' testimony who were there with her that Shireen, along with the other journalists that were targeted, were clearly marked as press. They were wearing blue flak jackets with the words press across the back and front, and they were wearing the special protective helmets that are worn by press in these conflict situations. So the group were clearly marked as press. Eyewitnesses and members of the group also said that prior to coming under fire from Israeli snipers, they made themselves known and aware to a group of Israeli snipers that were stationed across the street from them. And so they had made the Israeli forces aware of their presence, aware that they were journalists before they started moving in the area, and yet they were still targeted by Israeli forces and Israeli fire.
In fact, Al Jazeera has said in a statement that Abu Akleh was assassinated in cold blood. Would you agree with this description?
I would absolutely agree with this description. Again, she clearly was marked as press. Her colleagues were marked as press. It is shocking that the Israeli government, well, it's actually not that surprising that the Israeli government has attempted to deflect blame and responsibility for its killing of Shireen, claiming that there was Palestinian gunfire in the area. Of course, this is contrary to the eyewitness testimony of the journalists that were with her, and also from leading Israeli human rights group B'Tselem that actually went back to the scene and mapped out the points of where Palestinian gunmen and fighters allegedly were in the camp and where Shireen was actually killed. And they said it was impossible that Shireen was killed by Palestinian gunfire. So that only leaves one option, is that Israeli snipers who were stationed in the area and saw that Shireen, who was marked as a journalist, was shot and killed. And allegedly she was shot in an area right below her ear. So right between the area that was exposed, she was wearing a flak jacket and she was wearing a helmet. So that, you know, she was shot in an area that was barely exposed. That's the work of a very professional shooter. So yes, I would say that Al Jazeera's statement is accurate to what happened.
And You'll tell me what you think about this. Obviously, the where and the how, and as you say, those who are responsible are now trading blame, saying that fire was coming out from both sides. It has become part of political wrangling, while many people who are appalled by the killing are saying that there needs to be an independent investigation and that the Israeli government needs to be held accountable. Palestine has responded by saying that it will not be subject to an Israeli probe on this matter, when it was very clear that it was Israeli forces who committed this tragedy. What are your thoughts about this? Is it, in a way, I can't say a good thing, but an important discussion, because there have been a lot of wanton killings that nobody has taken responsibility for?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Look, I'll say that time and time again, Israel has been allowed by the international community, by the U.S. European countries, to act with impunity when targeting Palestinian civilians and Palestinian journalists in occupied Palestinian territory. In the far and few cases that Israel does launch investigations into the killings of Palestinians, those investigations often end up closed and without any real findings. And in the very, very few and rare cases where someone's actually held accountable, it's usually involving low-ranking soldiers. And according to Beit Salem, no one has actually been put on trial for harming Palestinians. So these calls for independent investigations, while they are perhaps necessary, I'm not sure how far or where they might lead, because this is not the first time that, for example, the U.S. has called for an investigation into the killing of a Palestinian-American. Just earlier this year, 80-year-old Omar Abu Asad was killed by Israeli forces during a raid on his hometown in the Ramallah district in the occupied West Bank. The U.S. also condemned that killing and called for an investigation. That was 4 months ago, and still nothing has come of it. So, while I think calling for investigations is great, and obviously condemning these killings are important, so long as those statements are not followed up by real action, Israel will continue to act with impunity.
So she was covering the raids in the city of Jenin in the northern West Bank, how those raids were carried out, and the conduct of the soldiers themselves. As you mentioned, that the United States, which itself is saying it would welcome an international probe, it's been accused of being complicit where human rights abuses have been raised in terms of not condemning the responsible parties. She would not have died in vain. So something has got to give. The conditions for journalists who are working in the West Bank and covering some of these, I dare say contested, because obviously you'll get different sides of the story from those who believe that theirs is not being covered. But the danger, that shouldn't need two sides of the story. It's plain to see, as we've mentioned, the circumstances under which she's died. From your experience, what needs to change? What greater protection needs to be given to journalists under those circumstances, and who should preside over that?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's plain and simple. Israel needs to be held accountable for its crimes. Shireen is not the first Palestinian journalist who has been killed by Israel. According to the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate, 86 Palestinian journalists have been killed since 1967, which is the year that Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And around 50 of those Palestinian journalists were killed since the year 2000. A few of them just in the past few years alone. Like I said, Israel needs to be held accountable for its crimes, whether that's in the International Criminal Court, whether that's in different international bodies or amongst third-party states. some accountability needs to happen. Other than that, Palestinian journalists or journalists working in Palestine will continue to be attacked every single day and will continue to be killed simply for doing their jobs as journalists. And
the reason I ask this, Yumna, is because the ICJP has said that Israel has a pattern of killing Palestinian journalists. And we've also seen a statement by the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate saying that it's going to file a formal complaint with the International Criminal Court alleging systemic targeting of Palestinian journalists. So, as you say, this is something that has been ongoing for a while, and it really needs the world to take it seriously now and deal with it at the highest level of multilateralism.
Yes, absolutely. As long as these stories continue to be brought forward on the world stage, there is a hope that some action will be taken, action perhaps, whether that's inside the International Criminal Court or elsewhere. But again, like I've said before, without action, it's very unlikely that the situation will change. In the past year alone, leading Israeli human rights groups, as some of the leading human rights groups in the world have accused Israel of the crime of apartheid, which, as South Africans know, is a crime under international law. So more attention needs to be brought to the crimes that are being perpetrated against the Palestinian people under occupation and under Israel's apartheid regime.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated, and condolences, of course, to you and your colleagues.